So, my name is Chloe Smith. I'm a fibre artist that is currently based on the New South Wales South Coast in a small town called Bermagui. I make work under the title of I Make Soft Food. Before we delve into this talk, I just wanted to ask if everybody could, if they're able to, grab a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil, whatever, to have sitting next to you and just start doodling and scribbling away as we chat. And I'll get to why this is relevant a little bit later. So for a little bit of context for the work that I create, if you haven't seen it, this piece showing right now is a work that I created a couple of years ago. It's my Serena tuna can. So all of my pieces are made almost entirely from wool and cotton and thread. In the case of this piece, I also used PVC and wire as well. So sometimes there's other materials that are involved. So something that people often say to me in relation to my work is, oh, you must have so much patience to do what you do. Another thing that people tend to ask, along with how long does it take to make a piece, is why did I start making this work in the first place? So I didn't study visual art and wasn't really doing anything related to the visual art world when I first started making these pieces. It really started as a kind of compulsion, a way of cataloging and interpreting the world around me, a way of engaging with a type of hyper observance. I started working with soft sculpture roughly about 5 years ago. At the time, I was working as a picker and packer in an aftermarket battery warehouse. I essentially spent 8 hours a day bagging camera and laptop batteries and chargers into individual postage bags to be sent off to people with point-and-shoot cameras or old Dell laptops. Lots of people were about to go on their dream holiday to Europe, or were finally sorting through their old family photos from some Christmas forever ago. And it was a large warehouse in North Melbourne. I mainly worked alone, doing a single repetitive task of picking up batteries, placing them in a bag, putting a label on the bag, and sending them out. So I had a lot of time to listen to podcasts, but I also just spent a lot of time thinking and wandering in my head. Around this period of time, I was sort of purposefully seeking out boring jobs. I applied for a job handing out dim sims at a supermarket, like sample dim sims. I applied for another one on a production line at the bread top factory, and another one writing copy for a paper company. So maybe it wasn't so much that I was looking for boring work as much as detailed work, jobs that involved a process line or could have had the potential of being defined as dull by others. I wanted something that directly engaged with process and something that had the potentiality of skiving up against something that could be perceived as cripplingly boring. So this image by Tracy Moffat often came into my head. If you haven't seen this series by Tracy Moffat, she's an Indigenous filmmaker and photographer. It's called First Jobs, and it's been a recurring source of inspiration for me. The candy colors recall this kind of perfect domestic world of advertising and mass marketing. Yet her images have this kind of disturbing quality to them. She's often somewhere digitally sort of inserted into these photos, looking pretty happy in some dull situations. And I think they kind of encourage the viewer to reflect on how these early experiences might limit as much as reveal the path ahead for us. So at the time, I didn't really know what I was after in all these kind of dull jobs that I was getting involved in. I suppose there was a kind of smugness in this like very dramatic rejection of my creative writing degree, and all these jobs seem to represent that. I think I probably also thought I was engaging in like a bit of like edgy gonzo style journalism by doing this. But it didn't really become clear to me until a bit later what was going on with all of these sort of dull jobs that I was taking on. So this is another one from the series of first jobs. So I got sacked from my job at the battery warehouse. They found a 16-year-old girl to replace me. I was 24 at the time, so they could pay her to do pretty much the same thing for a lot cheaper. So my smugness sort of quickly shifted into a bit of existential dread, and my ego took a pretty hard hit. A bit later, I got a job as a media monitor, and I worked on one of the federal election campaigns. My role was to tally up the airtime that ABC was giving to different members of parliament during the election campaign. So this was to ensure that they weren't giving unbiased coverage to either of the parties. So I sat at a desk for 8.5 hours a day, watched back-to-back coverage of politicians speaking on 1.5 speed, and counted the literal seconds that were passing as they were speaking. So these seconds were transferred into spreadsheets and passed on to data analysts that did all the fun stuff. So I became aware that I was literally counting the minutes that my life was passing by in an office. And as anyone who has worked in an office will know, time seems to operate pretty differently, even if your job is to count the time that is passing. This is an image that I took from my desk. Days are punctuated in an office by farewells and retirement morning teas, or fire drills, or horse racing sweepstakes. And the vignettes of office life started to seep into my imagination as I was kind of punching out these very repetitive data entry tasks for hours on end. And so my job in the office inspired this piece called the Farewell for What's Her Face. So it didn't just inspire this piece, but inspired an entire show about office food called Pimento Mori, which I held in 2017. The title Pimento Mori was a play on the Latin phrase memento mori, or remember you will die, which is often used in relation to vanitas still life paintings that explore notions of ephemerality, transience, and facing this notion of the certainty of death. So this is an example of one of those images. So I was beginning to wonder if there was something kind of masochistic about my obsession with the dull. Maybe I wanted to know how long I could spend in these spaces before it started to take a toll on my mental health. I liked thinking about all of these jobs that people had. I I like thinking about how the entire world seemed to be humming away because of people like me, willing to do banal shit for hours on end. I like thinking about all of these jobs lined up as if stretched out across a horizon of incredibly boring jobs, coating the earth, kind of people tinkering away with the busyness of mice or ants. This is another image from the Pimento Mori show. I felt like the protagonist in Nicholson Baker's book, The Mezzanine. For those who haven't read it, if I were to describe the plot to you, it would go a little something like this. A man is working in an office. His shoelace breaks. He goes to the chemist to buy a new shoelace. And that's pretty much it. But that's also not just it. It's actually one long study in minutia, in observance, in complete reverence of and enthusiasm for unnoticed details. And this is a quote from the book, which is one of my favorites. Perforation, shouted out, the deliberate, punctuated weakening of paper and cardboard so that it will tear along an intended path, leaving a row of fine-haired, white pills or tuftlets on each new edge. It is a staggering conception, showing an age-transforming feel for the unique properties of pulped wood fiber. Yet do we have national holidays to celebrate its development? Are festive volumes published honoring the dead greats in the field? People watch the news every night like robots, thinking they are learning about their lives, never paying attention to the far more immediate developments that arrive unreported on the Ziploc perforated top of ice cream cartons, in reply coupons bound in magazines, and on the please return this portion edging of bill stubs, on sheets of postage stamps and sheets of Publishers Clearinghouse magazine stamps, on paper towels, in rolls of plastic bags for produce at the supermarket, in strips of hanging file folder labels. The lines dividing one year from another in your past are perforated, and the mental sensation of detaching a period of your life for closer scrutiny resembles the reluctant guided tearing of a perforated seam. So these dull jobs made me so much more observant, almost like they stripped away the part of my brain that engages with critical theory and problem solving and terms like exegetical that I learnt at uni, and allowed me to hone in on the sound of different weights of paper cycling through the printer, or identifying staff members via the pitch of shoe scuff their steps sounded on the carpet. I had a desk facing the wall. It got me wondering how I might make a kind of art that could replicate the misting of sweat that appears on cheese whose accompanying crackers have, along with the apricot cheese, long since made their exit from the platter. I think the repetitive nature of line work or data entry allows you to enter a kind of flow state, clearing out the parts of your brain that get clogged up with to-do lists of everyday existence, which is where I think things began to come together with my obsession with the dull. I think the artist Linda Barry, for those of you who don't know, sums it up really well in this quote where she talks about boredom. She spends a lot of time talking about the importance of being bored and the effects it can have on our creativity in a few of her books, one of them being this one, Making Comics, and another one called Syllabus, which I highly recommend to anyone who feels like they're in a creative rut. So she says, boring meeting. You have a pen. The usual clowns are yakking. Most people will draw something, even people who can't draw. I say, if you're bored, what do you draw? And everybody has something they draw. Like, oh yeah, my little guy, I draw him, or I draw eyeballs, or palm trees. So I ask them, why do you think you do that? Why do you think you doodle during those meetings? I believe that it's because it makes having to endure that particular situation more bearable by changing our experience of time. It's so slight. I always say it's the difference between if you're not doodling, the minutes feel like a cheese grater on your face. But if you are doodling, it's more like a Brillo. It's not much better, but there is a difference. You could handle a Brillo a little bit longer than a cheese grater. So sewing these intricate soft sculptures became a kind of process in engaging with a form of boredom and repetition that was pretty comparable to the repetitive tasks I was doing at work. Current piece I've actually been working on is a replica of a very detailed marrow that I grew in the garden last spring. This is the kind of like detail that I don't know if you can see it that's going on at the moment. And so there's a lot of repetitive pattern work that I spend a lot of time getting to know. Using soft sculpture as my medium allows me to encourage people to look at the finer details of something like crinkle cut chips or barcodes on milk bottles in a way that they might not have taken the time to do before. The very nature of the illusion requires more time to be spent both on behalf of the viewer and also on behalf of me as the maker. All of my pieces are completely sewn by hand and generally take anywhere between 3 weeks and 3 months, sometimes longer. When I find something I want to make, I generally prefer to have the thing itself rather than work from a photo, mainly because I like to get a sense of texture. And this isn't always practical, which became clear when I had to go away and had to take the marrow with me. People have asked me how I started to work in this medium. Initially, I started wanting to explore soft sculpture and its capacity to act as a kind of immersion therapy. I started making a series of little cockroaches out of fabric and wire with the idea that they would turn into a large swarm of cockroaches. Though this project was never really fully realized. I was going through a bit of a rough time, and I liked thinking about the tactile nature of fabrics and their capacity to elicit different kinds of emotions. It made me wonder how we might be able to lean into uncertainty and discomfort if only we could come at it from a different angle, see it in a gentler light, and I guess ultimately just be a little less hard on ourselves. Once at a gallery, while looking at this mandarin peel sculpture that I had on show, I heard a guy say, "Oh, I just can't look at it. It makes me feel really strange." And I wasn't sure whether he had kind of like a trypophobic sort of response to it, but I really relished his reaction to the piece. And I've always wanted people to have a visceral reaction to these works, not just one that sees them as soft and cute and kind of adorable, I guess. Once I've decided how I want a piece to look, I'll start experimenting with building a 3D structure and unraveling the puzzle of how to complete the illusion. Sometimes I make patterns, like a dressmaker would make patterns. Sometimes I make little swatches of embroidery textures. But generally speaking, I don't make too much of a plan. You could call that intuitive, but I'd probably classify it as just a kind of impatience to get my hands moving and see the illusion come together for my own satisfaction. Once I'm happy with a piece, even if I'm not, I finish with a stylized shot of it like the ones I've shown throughout this talk. I spend a lot of time planning out how the photo shoots will work. Sometimes they've occurred in share houses with housemates kind of awkwardly perched on chairs or pieces propped up with a bike light, with me often kind of constantly checking the bomb app to see where the cloud cover is and making sure that it's not going to get in the way of my dramatic sunlit angles. For anyone who hasn't seen my Instagram stories on this, the lo-fi and unorthodox nature of the photography is something I take a lot of pleasure in, and I think it feeds into the silliness and humor of my process. So here's a couple of examples of how these photo shoots often play out. This was in the backyard, our very professional setup with a bird bath that I removed the head from, the bath section of it, which kind of went on to be this shoot. Also, one of my recent ones was a setup that I just kind of threw together on my porch, just employing kind of natural lighting, and I'll often use fabric as well as a backdrop, and that turned into this kind of soft focus Bonango shot that I did for a magazine. Many of us have never had to face the boredom that this pandemic has brought to our lives. Some of us might not have experienced the anxiety and depression either. While many of us have taken the time to make sourdough or finish projects that we once started or find new ways to stay connected, there seems to be this sort of lingering pressure to be some version of productive, no matter what that kind of looks like. The experience of being bored is something we begin to avoid as adults, probably because we have the agency to not be bored. Maybe we'll do some chores, spend some time on our phone, smoke a cigarette, get a coffee. When we're children, no one expects us to be productive. I often feel like the time I have to be bored is time I also get to be silly. As adults, we seem to only engage in tasks that have a direct and tangible outcome. There isn't a whole lot of wandering, and when you wander or be silly, you're really opening yourself up to different kind of outcomes. An example of said wandering and silliness was another completely unrelated project I worked on. And so I think that this space to wander and engage in this childlike silliness is a really big part of my process. Ultimately, I think that's where my obsession with mundane jobs came to influence my practice. It gave me brain space to begin wandering about in the minutiae of life, to be more observant in the beauty of the everyday. And I don't want this concept to be confused with a kind of toxic positivity, because, you know, I don't think it's this kind of notion of like, oh, you know, just make art and all the terrible stuff in the world will go away. I mean it more as a kind of cultivation of a type of curiosity when you have that honing in on details of life. So for me, the food isn't really the focus of the art that I make, even though a lot of my work is food, and as anyone who knows me knows that I'm obsessed with food. The food is more kind of a conduit to have these discussions about the mundane, about boredom, and about noticing things. I want people to engage with the discomfort and revulsion and attraction. I think that food and feeding oneself is the ultimate unavoidable task in our lives, no matter how you choose to do it, I guess. And I suppose there is some extent to which the food focus was aimed at people who felt indifferent about that rather than completely fascinated by it. As humans, there's obviously a huge spectrum of emotions that we engage with across our lives, but there are some we seek out and some we try to avoid. loneliness, boredom, and uncertainty seem to make up a large part of the feelings that we try to avoid, despite being a legitimate part of the broad spectrum of human emotions and experience. So I hope that this has been very boring for all of you, and that you've got some good doodling time out of it at least. I hope these ideas were maybe more like a Brillo pad on your face than a cheese grater, because a cheese grater is pretty unbearable. So yeah, thanks.